Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway or paypal.me/Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. Any amount is much appreciated, and I humbly thank you. Before I begin the segment, I would like to recite a powerful, relevant quote from comedian, author, and longtime civil rights activist, Mr. Dick Gregory. And that is, truth does not have to be validated by ignorance.
And they manipulate our history books. The history books are not true. It's a lie.
That's right, Michael.
The history books are lying. The history books are lying. You need to know that. You must know that.
If you sat around a table and you said, right, what we need to do is we need to find some way of getting young people to see the world the way we want them to see it, so that by the time they become adults, they are completely following the reality we want them to believe. Someone might say, well, they might not have it right, but you know the ideal thing? What we do is we have a system where we take children away from the parents at least 5 days a week, all day, from about the age of 4 and 5, and we have control of their minds until they're about 17, 18. That would be ideal. But of course, that's what happens. It's called the education system. And it's indoctrination.
American industrialists recognized that compulsory public education was the most useful means to socially engineer the American population to suit the purposes of industrial capitalism. Millions of Aborigines of America were forced into this social engineering experiment that resulted into rather a large complexity of fictional storytelling. This storytelling turned out to be our modernized educational system, and its background of malevolent intent cultivated and constructed the topic of American history, as nearly all of Americans were manipulated into believing it and stands by it still to this very day. One of the many fictional stories on display was the topic of the African slave trade of North America. And by all means, I will cover mostly all of what was deemed as official American history throughout my articles and videos, and especially this one. In this particular segment, I want to expose what was hidden deep beneath the rabbit hole during the 16th century and beyond. Many absurd theories were deemed as official accounts of history during that time period, so allow me to cover those and debunk them with costly certified publicly verifiable evidence one by one. First, according to the famously known and televised network corporation called the History Channel, slavery in America began in the year of 1619, when the first African slaves were brought to the colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Here is why that statement is totally inaccurate and false. Nearly 200 years prior to the African slave trade, there was an Indian slave trade operating throughout the New World, making the official recorded account of slavery in the Americas starting as early as the late 14th century, before and after the arrival of the Christian Italian reformer and explorer Cristoforo Colombo. Every single European nation that colonized North America utilized Indian slaves, or rather Aborigine people of America, for construction, plantations, and mining on the North American continent, but more frequently in their outposts in the Caribbean and in the metropolis of Europe. Without slavery, slave trading, and other forms of unfree labor, the European colonization would have remained extremely limited in the New World. The Spanish were almost totally dependent on Aborigines of America's labor in most of their colonies, and even where unfree labor did not predominate, as in the New England colonies. Colonial production was geared towards supporting the slave plantation complex of the Caribbean outposts, later known as the West Indies. During the late 1600s and the early half of the 1700s, there was an active slave trade by several European nations in the east half of North America. Wars of colonial expansion led to many indigenous Aborigine captives being enslaved. The accurate number of the indigenous Aborigines that were forced into slavery are unavailable to me at this time due to my current budget, but during this nearly 200-year period, possibly hundreds of thousands became slaves in the Canadian and American colonies. More indigenous Aborigines, known as Indian slaves at that time, were sent to Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa, where African slaves were traded for Indian slaves. The Spanish, English, and French were all involved in the slave trade. In 1619, an area of land called Point Comfort, Virginia, now called Fort Monroe, Virginia, was the alternative destination, and I'll state why it was the alternative destination shortly, of the very first authentic African slaves to have ever reached the North American lands, having been previously captured and enslaved by Northern Africans, and then later sold to the Caucasian Spaniard Europeans.
You know, there were African middlemen, and they would fight wars with other Africans to enslave them, to sell to the white man. Slavery was a huge business for different African kingdoms. You know the story that we got when we were kids, that your ancestor was out on one Sunday with his girlfriend and some white man jumps out of the bush and throws a net over him? It's not how it happened. Slavery was big business. Africans sold other Africans to the Europeans.
Also, during the year of 1619, the secretary of the Virginia colony and the husband of the now famously known and self-proclaimed Indian princess by the name of Pocahontas, John Rolfe, was in charge of documenting every single detail about what was really happening throughout the Virginia colony. And also, he was ordered to report it all back to England. All of Rolfe's reportings were documented inside of his journal, now located in England. Only small bits and pieces of his journal and other governmental documents are kept in the US at the LOC in the National Archives. So, I've managed to purchase the costly authentic journal of John Rolfe. And I would like to share with you these many hidden secrets about the truth surrounding this topic of discussion at hand, because it all correlates with each other and systematically changes the game of what we were forcefully taught throughout American history programs, still to this very day. In August of 1619, in a bit of a broken English Latin way, John Rolfe wrote in his journal that, quote, "In the latter part of August, a slave ship arrived and brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape Merchant brought for victual, at the best and easiest rate they could." Side note, the objective word Negro in the Portuguese language means of dark-skinned. According to Rolfe's journal, these 20 and odd Negroes, or rather Africans, came directly from the villages of Ndongo, Congo, and Kabaza, located in Angola, Africa, the southern part of Africa during that time period. Now, before we go any further, I want to note that what I just mentioned from this authentic 16th century documentation single-handedly debunks all 19th century and beyond telltale stories of the African slaves in America being immigrants of West Africa. Now you're probably saying that it's just these particular slaves being from South Africa, right? And my answer to that is, this is not even close to being half of my presentation of this particular segment. I'm just getting started. And you don't have to believe me. I'm just here to make you think. To watch the full-length version of this video with even more untold details and information included, follow the link in the description below, exclusively on the Dane Calloway YouTube channel only.